walking tour of Beirut the first summer I was there, and I noticed that the only places in central Beirut that still had yet to be rehabilitated were the Shia neighborhoods. And so you can see actually there are posters of Imam Sadr in there. And I think that even though it's not scientific, I think that's very telling of the experience that Shias have had in Lebanon. They've been very marginalized, neglected by the government. And so I think it's an essential context to understand why Islamic resistance movement is so powerful in Lebanon. And then the other picture is actually taken I can't remember where it was, but it's just northern Lebanon. And it just shows how very sectarian the country is. And so it's organized along sectarian lines in the sense that every time there's an election, the president is going to be Christian, the prime minister will be Sunni, and the speaker of the parliament will be Shia. And so I will read to you some of the kinds of just the kind of religious political mixture that they have in Lebanon. So here in the back row, there's Rafiq Hariri, who's the former head of the Future Movement, known as 14 March. There's a picture of Jesus, and then General Michel Aoun, who's the head of the Free Patriotic Movement, currently the president. And then in the middle, there's Nimat Allah Qassab al-Hardini, a Maronite saint. Next to him, Syed Hassan Nasrallah. And then he's, of course, the head of Hezbollah, which is the 8th of March. And then again, Rafiq Hariri. And then there's Samir Jaja, who's the head of the Lebanese forces. And in the bottom row, there's various Maronite saints, Jesus again, and then Michel Silliman, who's the former president of Lebanon, and he's aligned with 14 March. So the two main movements doesn't really work so much today, but after the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, there's two main movements in Lebanon. One is 8th March, and the other is 14 March. So 14 March is largely allied with France, United States, the Gulf. And then 8th March is largely allied with Iran and Syria. So moving on, this picture is going to look scary to you. And if you want to share this presentation, I'm happy for you to, but maybe you should delete this sign because it's very strange. So what happened is that I was in Lebanon on and off between 2009 and then 2017. My longest stint in Lebanon was between 2010 and 2011. I was there for a year and a half. And while I was doing my field research, it was uncovered by Hezbollah that the CIA was actually using the embassy in Al-Qar to spy on Hezbollah and their allies. And they were posing as researchers looking into the charities affiliated with Hezbollah. And that is exactly what my research project was. So I was looking at how faith and rationality intermingle in the various institutions that the charities affiliated with the Islamic movement were promoting and were putting forth. And so I actually had to stop my research in the middle of my field research, but I couldn't because I was on a grant that basically said that I had to stay in Lebanon. It was a Fulbright Hays, and so I couldn't leave the country, and I had to do something. And so I was having this spiritual crisis, like, what am I going to do? I didn't want to talk to any of my friends or contacts because it could put them at risk. And so I had to sort of take a step back and think about, well, what is it that I'm researching? And so I spoke to a lot of people and I got some ideas. And the first idea that I really wanted to think about was how our ideas of faith in Western context have evolved so dramatically since the Enlightenment. So I looked at the origins of faith in Christian thought when it was defined as that which God requires of humans in the relationship with God. According to Wolsterstoff, who's a scholar, a philosophical, religious scholar, the root meaning of the word faith in classical and Hellenistic Greek is pistis, or trust, reliance, belief in, or confidence. And in certain nuances, faith even means to obey. In the Old and New Testaments, faithfulness means fidelity, endurance, and hope, both in the hearts and on the lips of the faithful. So this is probably a very familiar idea of faith. But as he also clarifies, faith is not just belief, because belief also requires faith in the one who is trusted. So here, the whole point of this is that faith is a way of knowing. It's a form of knowledge. It's not relegated to some inferior way of thinking or feeling. It's actually really important, and it's necessary in creating knowledge. Plantinga, who's another philosopher, religious thinker, he elaborates on this point by saying that belief in God means trusting God, accepting his purposes, committing one's life to him, and living in his presence. Therefore, according to this understanding, the person who trusts in God also believes, and this is a form of knowledge. Accordingly, knowledge requires faith, and the two are deeply intertwined. However, of course, the Western Enlightenment comes. Sorry, I thought I did that. Oop. The Western Enlightenment comes and completely transforms everything. And it's very intertwined with the colonial projects, not only just colonialism, but also Orientalism and imperialism. So this transformed our understandings in the West of faith, knowledge, and reason. Assad explains, this is Talal Assad, if you want, I can give you a list of bibliography if you're interested, explains how the constitution of the modern state required the forcible redefinition of religion as belief and of religious belief as sentiment and identity as personal matters that belong to the newly emerging space of private as opposed to public life. As a result, religious belief in the West became something that is privatized, personal, and unconnected to the social world, whereas the objective social sciences and, of course, the natural sciences started to dominate society and politics. Assad describes how the privatization of religion in Europe accompanied the universalization of Western conception of what religious belief entails, presenting belief as an alternative ideology from the consciousness of reality. So belief here is no longer a social relational experience, but something that is either accepted or rejected by the individual. Not only are faith and rationality becoming mutually exclusive in this framework, but faith is also a lower kind of knowledge. So I needed to do this for myself to really think about, okay, where are the differences between the different cultures and the religions? And a lot of it doesn't come from the actual religious or the social context, but from the intellectual forces that were behind modernization, behind colonialism, behind this idea, this myth that white people are superior. So the Western Enlightenment thus transforms philosophical thinking, which became dominated by classical foundationalism. This is going to get a little bit theoretical, but I just want to put it out there that this was a radical break for Western societies to change the way they thought about faith and rationality. So, classical foundationalism is a theory of rationality developed by English philosopher John Locke, which supposes that there are two kinds of belief: what can be considered as basic belief and what is based on other beliefs. So in other words, there are immediate starting points or foundations for all mediated beliefs. Classical foundationalism contends that basic beliefs must either be self-evident or incorrigible, the latter relating to a state of consciousness. So that is like, okay, if a tree falls in the forest and we don't hear it, does it still fall? Of course it still falls. So that's the kind of reasoning that John Locke brings to this. But according to Locke, religion is neither self-evident nor incorrigible. Therefore, unless religious views are supported by evidence, they are not rational. This is a complete change from what the Christians would have thought otherwise before that. So, unless religious views are supported by evidence, they are not rational. Subsequently, most Western philosophers have examined how people arrive at their belief in God's existence according to Locke's framework. And I'm sure you encounter this a lot, where people try to get you to rationalize something that is not going to be broken down in the same way. They're starting from a different starting point, and this is the problem. This is why there's so much misunderstanding. So in this way, the dominant form of secular reason is centered in the Western experience, while the Islamicate is forced into the peripheries. This understanding of rationality is linked to scientific and mathematical theories and methods that also dominate the social sciences. And yet even for Max Weber, who's a huge Orientalist, a very influential German social theorist, he actually thought rationality was much more complicated. So he believed that there were a multiplicity of rationalization processes that variously conflict and coalesce with one another at all societal and civilizational levels. So a few scholars have nicely separated these into four different categories. One is conceptual, and this is the sort of like scientific enlightenment kind of rationality. And then there's the instrumental rationality, which is the means end. It's the homo economicus, the trying to maximize something. And then there's the formal systemic, which is what keeps the system going. And then there's the substantive, ethical, and religious, which is, for me, the important kind of rationality that I was looking at, the religious rationality. And so he believed that all of these worked together in concert, and that without all of them, society is in danger. And so that's his seminal work on capitalism in the United States, the Protestant ethic. He basically saw this religious system that originally was based on all four kinds of rationality, but he saw it being hollowed out and being limited to just the instrumental, informal, systemic. And because of that, he was basically saying the Americans are building an iron cage around themselves, and I concur. So Weber, he was actually, that book was a warning, even though he was very Orientalist, and there's a lot of problems with his research. That particular book was a warning, saying we can't let this go too far. A lot of people get it wrong and think that he actually was really admiring it. He was really scared of it, and it comes out with the iron cage. Okay, so now on to critical Muslim studies. Now, this is what helped me to try to really take myself out of myself and put myself in Lebanon, in that situation I was in. So the point of critical Muslim studies is the decolonial. It's trying to understand how much Orientalism constitutes everyday knowledge in Europe and the West, and actually in Lebanon if they're Eurocentric. So explaining critical Muslim studies, it's a very complicated subject, but Salman Saeed, who's my boss at Leeds, he actually does a really good job in his work, and we have a journal called Reorient. And basically, the essentials is that it rejects positivism, essentialism, and foundationalism. So here, if you think of ideas of white superiority, it doesn't work in critical Muslim studies because white is not a skin color, it's a state of mind. And so anybody who is Eurocentric is considered white in that framework. So it's taking away the ways of judging people by identity politics, for example. We don't believe in that. It rejects secular modernity as the path to becoming good or noble or the only way of being. And here, he, as Syed puts it, Western secular modernity is considered to be the unfolding of history. So here, history happens in the West. It doesn't happen in the peripheries. So critical Muslim studies rejects this, rejects Westernese, which is locating the Western experience at the center of all knowledge. And so the point of decoloniality here is to decenter the West as the master referent. So here what we're saying is that the sign must change for the signifier to be properly understood. So if we're talking about democracy in Islam, the starting point is Islam, not Greece. The wonderful quote that he uses that puts this quite beautifully here is, "It is not that Islamists use ideas that are themselves Western, but the description of the ideas as Western retroactively constructs them as such." And I think we really saw this with the Arab uprisings. A lot of commentators got them completely wrong. They didn't understand the role of faith and religion and resistance in these uprisings. And really, the election results that turned out, I think, proved most commentators wrong. And I don't think that those countries were getting the support that they needed to sustain their democracies. So just to give you an idea of what visually a CMS approach might look like, this is a map, an ancient map of the world that centers Jerusalem at the heart of the world. So this is an understanding of us, our world, our continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, but with faith at the heart. So that's very central to my research, putting Islam and faith at the center. And this is a painting by a Turkish Nusrat Kolpan. And this is basically just centering Islam. This is why do maps about the world? Why don't they look like this? Why is the one map that we have so prioritizing Europe and the United States, and in ways that are actually geographically wrong? Like if you actually want to know the true size of Alaska, it's so much bigger, so much smaller than what is appearing. If you want to know the size of Brazil, it's so much bigger than what appears on the normal map. And so we let ourselves get brainwashed, I think, that there's only one reality. This is like a legacy of the Enlightenment, looking for truth, when actually reality looks very different depending on where you're standing. So while I was in the field, sitting there twiddling my thumbs, wondering what to do, I realized that there was actually a lot of similarities between Christian liberation theology and the charities that I was looking at in Lebanon. So Christian liberation theology is responding to not only the experiences of colonial oppression and capitalist exploitation, but also this crisis in Western philosophy and the social sciences. The point is to repoliticize religion and revalue faith as a way of knowing. So there's two different ways of thinking. It's bringing religion back in the social world so that it could have very real political consequences, but it's also about changing what we think we know and how we know it. The Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 65 was launched to rectify the Catholic Church's increasing disengagement with its worldwide followers, responding to the philosophical notion that belief and knowledge are mutually exclusive. Franz Hinkelmart describes liberation theology as living theology that responds to contemporary injustices. For example, the General Council of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982 called apartheid in South Africa a sin, stressing that the moral and theological justification of it is a travesty of the gospel and, in its persistent disobedience to the word of God, a theological heresy. The subsequent Kairos document in 1985 urgently called for those churches complicit in apartheid to repent and embrace liberation theology and for the entire world to act now against injustice. And I think we forget how important this role of the church was. And that's why I totally embrace and applaud our Palestinian friends who are also, they have a Kairos Palestine document that they're trying to get support. And it is actually working in the United States. Surprisingly, there are quite a few churches that have now passed resolutions supporting BDS, for example. This is because Christian liberation theology does not start with scripture, but with the situation of those suffering poverty and exploitation, so starting with the poor. As such, liberation is something that happens not in the afterlife, but in the here and now. The question for Gustavo Gutierrez, often described as the father of Christian liberation theology, he's from Peru, is how to say to the poor, God loves you. To answer this question, he believes that it is necessary to struggle with the poor, because how to speak about God without taking into account the suffering of the poor is not easy. The question is larger than our possibilities to answer. We need to struggle with them against injustice in order to answer this question. And yet liberation theology actually goes a lot further. As Gutierrez further explains, in the old times, philosophy was the expression of common reason. Today, this is not the case. Today, we have science and the social sciences. For liberation theology, philosophy is relevant, but social science is also relevant because of poverty. Prophetic language is to take the language of the poor, to link God and the poor, and to denounce injustice. And to name the reasons of poverty is the prophetic language. Justice is a central point, but Job is implying another language, a mystical language. God loves us gratuitously. To believe in God is to believe in gratuitous love. Human love must be gratuitous also. We need to employ both languages. And this really appeals to me because if we think about some of the, as an American, for me, some of the most powerful thinkers that changed my country were Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and both of them spoke the language, the prophetic language. And for some reason, that was allowable. I don't know why, what has changed, why that's not allowable anymore. When Obama's preacher tried to, when the videos came out of Obama's preacher and he was basically speaking prophetic language, basically my society condemned this preacher. And so I don't know what's happened to Americans that has made us close off to the possibility of prophetic language and love, but it's quite shocking. Similar to the thought of Iranian revolutionary thinker Ali Shariati, who I'll talk about, this project of liberation is about transforming not only the conditions of the world, but also how we understand ourselves and each other. So moving on to what I call Islamicate liberation theology. So basically, I find that is very similar. Here, faith, love, reason, rationality, and knowledge are all interconnected. They're not separated. We're not talking about the same kind of enlightenment, prioritizing of a specific, rational, reasonable, particularly male. This is about knowledge that's more open. It's a hermeneutical approach that is historicized. So religious figures become revolutionary exemplars. In liberation theology, of course, the figure would be Jesus. In Islamicate liberation theology, there's a whole host of characters that become important. There is a potential to realize new knowledges and new historical possibilities, and most importantly, from my research in Lebanon, is that it's the duty of all to struggle against oppression. So if you see someone being treated unfairly, you have a duty to act. So I think the unique thing about Islamic hate liberation theology is that it's never been complicit in any kind of colonial, Western colonial project, the colonialism with a capital C. Obviously, there's been empires, but it's not the same. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire was very different from the British Empire. And so there's actually quite a lot of potential and power, and my theory of why my country hates Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran so much is this very thing, is that we actually understand that it's a proper opponent, it's a proper alternative. So this helped me in my research to think about what it was that I was looking at, what it was that I was finding out and experiencing, and people were sharing with me in Lebanon. And it's what I call a resistant subjectivity. So it's a faith and a commitment to the cause of revolutionary Islamic activism, allowing for negotiations with secular liberalism, but from a decentered or decolonial position, creating new counter-hegemonic social configurations. And so the point here is that secularism, liberalism, they often get a bad rap because the way we think about them is completely Western, the Western forms, but actually you can have much more modified relations with an idea of a secular whereby there's some sort of inclusivity. It's not about ignoring religion the way, the way British does, or regulating religion the way France does. But it's about creating a space where multiple religions can speak. And also with liberalism is that there are aspects of economic liberalism that make sense, or political liberalism that makes sense, but it doesn't have to go to the extreme of the neoliberal project that we've seen to be dominant here, specifically here in the UK, probably even more here than in the United States, but particularly the Anglo-American experience of hyper-individual, quantified, just crazy kinds of liberalism on steroids is what I call it. So now I'm going to look at some of the key thinkers that I looked at. So again, while I was waiting in Lebanon, not being able to do my research, I asked all my participants, who are the thinkers that I should read, the Islamic thinkers that inspire you, that helped create your movement and your work? And so, of course, we start with Dr. Ali Shariati. In the decades leading up to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, I'm first going to give you a little bit of background about the situation that's happening in the 1950s and 60s. The frequent cross-migration of clerics meant that the politicization of Islam in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon had already created a regional movement by the mid-20th century. During the 1950s and 60s, senior Muslim clerics from these three countries all studied together in the region's holy cities, Qom and Mashhad in Iran and Najaf in Iraq, moving from one to the other to expand their learning. So, for example, Iraqi-born Ayatollah Fadlallah of Lebanon studied in Najaf with Ayatollah Bakr al-Sadr in Iraq, and Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. So they all studied together. Meanwhile, Iranian-born Imam al-Sadr studied with both clerics in both Iran and Iraq before settling in Lebanon. And then Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the current Secretary General of Hezbollah in Lebanon, is also connected to all four people. So that just gives you an idea. There was a real movement going on. In addition to promoting a revolutionary Islam that shares many similarities with Christian liberation theology, each of these scholars created vast networks of grassroots institutions in their respective communities to empower marginalized Shias. And so that was what was very important for my research, was the social network that these different scholars created. So they're scholars, activists, political leaders, amazing humans all together. I will start off the discussion with Dr. Ali Shariati, often considered the Iranian intellectual behind the Islamic Revolution in 1979. As a youth, he was active alongside his father in the movement of God-worshipping socialists. And importantly, all of the scholars that I'm talking about had a both religious and a quote-unquote secular education. And so I think that's really interesting how they piece them together. Shariati believed that modern science is itself an ideology, one that destroys the human spirit and reproduces the status quo. So here, this is the kind of post-Enlightenment science that elevates reason and is looking for capital T truth, as if we're not all positioned humans working together, using our relations to come up with solutions. So this is like against the one-man theory of history, where Einstein was the one who developed something, where actually he was writing letters to his wife who helped him come up with his theories. The same thing with Darwin. There are lots of people doing the same thing. Why do we have this very myopic idea of history? So in a work, I think this is quite a genius work, entitled Islamology, the basic design for a school of thought and action, Shariati maintained that Muslims should view the entirety of life through an Islamic lens. By suggesting that Islam is an ideology as well as a culture, he conceptualized Islam as a living religion with revolutionary potential. He suggested that faith is something that Muslims feel as much as they know. And as such, faith provides a framework for understanding all aspects of life, including science. To further clarify his ideas, he characterized two different kinds of knowing: scientific facts and the spirit or meaning that is hidden in an idea. So the latter would be completely relegated to like non-science, non-knowledge in the Western framework. He believed that the latter is deeper than the former and that our ideologies help us to make sense of both. So he proposed that Muslims combine them to realize a third kind of Islamicized knowledge, a raised level of awareness and a commitment to movement, because viewing scientific knowledge through this kind of Islamic lens can support a progressive politics. So this is a very transformational way of thinking. Now, I put at the bottom what I consider a resistant subjectivity of Shariati is that he basically, building on the work of Frantz Fanon, he called for the need for the third world to create a new man based on a new idea and a new history. And I think this is really important because, again, a lot of the Western thinking comes from a very particular European idea of a man and the starting point. And obviously it didn't include women. It didn't include a lot of the voices and the people in history who actually helped make Europe Europe. It just tries to focus just on a white man, this caricature. And so I think this idea of a new man is really important. And moving on to Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the spiritual and political leader of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, believed that divine governments foster a dialectic between the natural and the divine, helping humans to realize their true potentials by also guiding their morality and behavior in personal or private life. You probably know much of this, but he reasoned that everyday life is inseparable from the divine, because according to the prophets, this world is merely a means, a path to achieve a noble aim. While he is known more in the West as a religious and political leader, Khomeini was also a respected intellectual. His mastery of using reason to articulate religious concepts is evident in his essay, The Same Thing in Different Languages. In this short work, he suggested that humans have different languages to express the same concepts. Thus, we must always use our reason in interpreting what others say. In the same way, humans must use rationality to understand the meaning of religious concepts. So, while we can use metaphors to speak about God, none of these metaphors will ever fully correspond to the sustaining embrace of all beings, for that embrace means that there is no place in creation where he does not exist. By politicizing religion, Khomeini helped to create a permanent resistance to the Shah during the Islamic Revolution. As he recounted, every time somebody was killed, the faithful would recite a Fatiha, or the opening chapter of the Holy Quran, during which time another person would be killed, struggling the recitation of another Fatiha. And this way, the struggle continued organically without any interruption. And finally, his reasoning that the phrase a democratic Islamic republic was an insult to Islam because it presumed that democracy and justice are extrinsic to Islam. So for me, this is a real example of a resistant subjectivity. This is a centering of Islam and Iran. This is not cowering to what other people say you should do. This is insisting that this is the truth. So moving on to Ayatollah Baqir al-Sadr, it's interesting because a lot of my participants in Lebanon cited his work as being particularly important to Hezbollah. So Baqir al-Sadr developed a radical ideology that conceived of Islam as a total life system. He was an Iraqi Islamic and political activist, and one of the founders of Hizb ut-Tahrir party and other social institutions. Again, you probably are very familiar with this, but just in case. So he developed a radical ideology that conceived of Islam as a total life system, a program for a social, political, and economic way of being that is based on both scientific methods and religious texts. This new way of Islamic thinking served to protect Muslim societies from foreign and ideological invasions, as well as to prepare the ground for organized political action. He borrowed ideas from Egyptian scholar and Islamic activist Sayyid Qutb, but focused on the moral corruption of secular political regimes rather than modern society more generally. So his real ambition was to change the state. An example of his resistant subjectivity is the fact that Bakr al-Sadr argued that the post-colonial secular state had strayed so far from Islamic principles that the struggle against it should take a revolutionary form, in the sense that only a radical reimagining of the state could achieve social justice. And then moving on to finally getting to Lebanon. So Imam al-Sadr, his work is not as well known because he didn't write it down. Most of his work was through activism, but his family is actually starting to finally publish a lot of his work in all different kinds of languages, so it's really quite beautiful. So he was an Iranian-born Lebanese Islamic and political activist. He was founder of the Amal movement and other massive social institutions, and after his mysterious disappearance in 1979, his followers went on to form Hezbollah. So his project was revolutionary. He believed that religion and science were born twins and suggested that between science and religion there is an infallible bond, and they determine the standard by which to measure humans' destiny and level of perfection. For science, in short, is an illumination to view reality and discover the truth being Allah's creations and demands. To illustrate his resistant subjectivity, he drew on the story of Karbala and Imam Hussein to argue that this revolution did not die in the sands of Karbala. It flowed into the life stream of the Islamic world and passed from generation to generation, even to our day. It is a deposit placed in our hands so that we may profit from it, that we may extract from it a new source of reform, a new position, a new movement, a new revolution to repel the darkness, to stop tyranny, and to pulverize evil. And as I will discuss, he also is very well known for doing a lot of work with Christians, and I will talk about that when I discuss some of my field's findings. The last thinker I'm going to talk about before going into the research finding, I'm sorry this is taking so long, is Ayatollah Fadlallah. So, Lebanese Islamic activist Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, who established the country's largest social services network, Al-Mabara Association. Fadlallah believed that a political system must be based on the three principles of love, justice, and mercy. Thus, one's love of God is what saves humans from feeling weak in the face of tyranny, as well as what inspires them to necessary action when others are oppressed. I find this so similar to what Gustavo Gutierrez talked about, just a bit more of an acknowledgement that military struggle is also required. Fadlallah embraced a scientific approach to religion that breaks down sectarian boundaries. He strongly believed that religious leaders must be qualified in the social sciences, as this is essential knowledge to have in order to become an effective religious leader. An example of his resistant subjectivity is that he argued when those who adopt a position of neutrality, this is a quote, in a case of oppression in political systems where the weak are dominated or persecuted in the name of preserving an effective rule of law, or in systems founded on monopoly, manipulation, cheating, usury, or corruption, and built through stealing, bribing, depriving oppressed people of their rights, would be subject to God's punishment when positive or conclusive actions could have been taken instead. And I think that's quite really beautiful, because it's not just about you have the responsibility to act, but not just act foolishly. You have to act when it's going to possibly make a difference. So I feel like that's a really beautiful conditional that he adds in there. So now I'm going to talk about some of the fieldwork examples of what I think reminds me of a resistant subjectivity. So the first is a quotation by Dr. Ali Fayyad, who's a MP with Hezbollah. He also is a huge intellectual and was the head of one of their research centers for a very long time. So he told me there's a dua or prayer by the Prophet Muhammad. He said, My God, help me to see reality as it is. That's pretty important. And it's been an historical and philosophical challenge throughout the history of humanity. It's one of the most important theoretical challenges, to get the methodology, to understand the facts or the reality. And the philosophical relationship between ideas and facts. This prayer of Prophet Muhammad, he asked for God to be to get the ideas, the methodology, the perspectives to understand the realities and facts around him. I believe in God, I believe in Islam, and the values of Islam control my behaviors, but at the same time, I have to respect the mind. I have to respect logos, and I have to be based on logic, the rules of logic. And I think the values of Islam are not in contradiction with the rules of logic. So here he's definitely positioning his way of expressing Islam, reason, faith, all of that is counter to the post-Enlightenment framework. So a couple more examples. One is from Syed Hassan Nasrallah, and this is actually from a speech he delivered. I was lucky I got a chance to get all of his speeches during the time I was in Lebanon, translated by one of my colleagues. So he said, the developments and events in the last 3 decades, at least since 1982, prove that the correct, realistic, rational, logical, fruitful, and effective choice that leads to the achievement of goals is the popular armed resistance, and the unrealistic, absurd, irrational, maddening choice, which does not lead to any goal, but rather leads only to depression, frustration, humiliation, degradation, and begging on the doors and thresholds, is the choice of negotiations. And I'm sure President Abbas in the West Bank probably would cry if he heard that, because he wouldn't be able to come back with it. It's so logical that sometimes you just have to fight for what you need. And then for Ayatollah Fadlallah, after the 2006 war, and I should have added actually when I was talking about the CIA that Israel deliberately targeted so many of the institutions of Hezbollah, Amabra, and Imam Sadr in the 2006 war. Millions of dollars. Orphanages were deliberately targeted. Schools were deliberately targeted. And so actually, because of the extent of the damage, I really had a difficult time getting access to a lot of research participants, and I had to do a lot of my research informally. And I almost didn't want to know the information, because if I did get it, it could actually expose these institutions, these young kids sometimes, to aggression if there was another attack by Israel. So after the 2006 war, Ayatollah Fadlallah insisted that successfully rebuilding the institutions would represent a triumph of knowledge over the desire to destroy. In defiance of the Israeli aggression, charity will persevere. So another example by Dr. Ali Fayyad of a resistant subjectivity is when I asked him about how does faith play any role in your institutions? And so he responded in 2 ways. Here in Lebanon, the Shia charities are parts of our battery against the occupation and the external challenges, because our society, or Hezbollah and the Amal movement, and all the Shia movements, they believe we need a strong society to win our war against the occupation. From this point of view, there is a revolutionary dimension to these charities. There is a resistant dimension to these charities. We don't mind for the poor people to be rich, but this is not the cause of these charities. So he's saying that, we don't mind if people become middle class or make a good living out of this. We just want to be able to create strong communities that are capable of resisting. And then he answered, if you would like to analyze the theoretical background of Hezbollah's economic approach, I think you will find it close to the social democratic government and parties. And we defended the Keynesian state, the workers' state. I mean that we are not against the liberal economic system, but we are strongly against neoliberalism. We are caring about the poor people in the remote countries, and we have to safeguard the social guarantee with the necessary systems, institutions, procedures, and policies. So here, one of the things I was trying to figure out is